Greetings. Welcome to our next session together. Today we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 5, that chapter in its entirety, verses 1 to 32. So if you would at this time, go ahead and pause the video, have someone in your group go ahead and read that chapter out loud while the rest of you follow along. Okay, so we're going to go through and we're just going to kind of draw out a couple of main themes from this story here. What you're going to notice right off the bat is most of this chapter is a genealogy. And so we get a little bit of the record, and along with that, we get some ages. And with that, you're going to notice, of course, that the ages of some of these people, actually most of them, are quite long compared to what is normal today. People living 800, 900 plus years even. And on top of that, you'll have people having children at later years as well. We know that Adam fathered Seth when he was 130. Mahalalel lived 65 years, fathered Jared. There was another who was, I believe, 182. Yeah, Lamech lived 182 years and then fathered Noah. So what you have is, in some way, what we consider to be a normal lifespan we have, except in this, everything is just kind of stretched out. So what would be typical for us in 80 or 90 years, all of those, it seems, life experiences are sort of multiplied. And so people are living longer, having children for longer periods of time. And this is, of course, due to a few factors. First of all, we know that, of course, because of Adam and Eve's decisions, because of their sin, that death is now a part of creation. This is going to be indicative of everything that lives in creation, that it's going to eventually die. These generations lived a long time, and partly because the world, the environment, even our own bodies seem to be quite different before the flood. It seems like after the flood caused some pretty massive changes in our world and in our environment, and even with ourselves. So the aging process before the flood was a lot slower, a lot less efficient, I guess you could say, in that regard. And so people lived a lot longer. They also had an important task that God had given Adam and Eve at the beginning, and that was to multiply and to fill the earth. And so this mandate, of course, would be diminished and more challenging if people didn't live as long. But if they can live for long periods of time, and they can father children, and women can be mothers for longer periods of time, then you have the potential of really massive growth in terms of numbers of human beings. So it would also serve to provide more spouses. So when you think about this, of course, everyone, as we talked about last time, who was Cain's wife? Well, of course, he had to marry someone that was related to him. I mean, there's no other option from the narrative. However, it doesn't necessarily have to be a sister. Could have been. You could have even had several generations removed, and so we're not really told exactly. So, but the potential for growth of the human race is much more magnified when you have just a lot more time and frankly a lot more years capable of having children and multiplying. So that's something that you're going to notice that for us is, of course, very strange because that's atypical. The oldest people tend to live now. I mean, 100 is quite old for what we see. There are some people who live longer than that. It seems to be later on, it seems that God caps the number or the age for humans at 120. There might be a different perspective on that, but that seems to hold pretty true. I don't know of anyone who has lived to 120. They in more recent times, modern times, they may have come close, but that's really pushing it. Now, something else you're going to notice, and this is in verse 3 of chapter 5. So if you take a look at that, let's just read this together. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, named Seth. Now, the language there kind of harkens us back to the creation of man. When God created Adam, we know that he created him in his own image, after his own likeness. And so the phrasing here, I think, is done for a reason. And let's talk about that. There might be a couple of reasons why presumably Moses, or one of his scribes, the human author, includes this. And of course, God, in his overarching inspiration of Scripture, wanted this stated in this way. Now, there's a couple of things. This could indicate that Adam is carrying on the mission that God had given him, and that was that he indeed is to multiply. And so, when he bears offspring, this offspring is bearing that same image that he was given from God. And so not only are we as humans, not only are we image bearers or imagers, however you want to think of that, of God, but also we have been given the ability to perpetuate that image. So it wasn't just first generation that Adam was an image bearer of God, but also that was passed on, and that ability to bear God's image. Again, several sessions back, we had talked about Adam and his creation and bearing the image of God, and what that could mean, what that could not have meant, likely. And so this idea being here that this trend is being carried forward, that Adam was an image bearer, and he is also then bearing imagers after his kind, so to speak. Now, this of course, in that sense, would be a good thing, that the image of God is continually passed down, and I think that that's the case. We see some indication later. Jesus mentions this when he's talking about the image and the inscription on a coin for, and we actually talked about this when we talked about Adam bearing his image and what that meant. But Jesus harkens on that idea, and it seems to assume that all humans still bear God's image. Another side of this that might come along with it is that we know that at this time, Adam and Eve are also they're also rebels of God, so they have disobeyed him, and so perhaps that is also something that is being passed on as well. So the idea that Seth was born and sort of bore the image of Adam, that might mean something more than just continuing to bear God's image. Now, all of a sudden, since Adam had sinned, had fallen, that there's another nature that is being passed on as well. And so whatever Adam was at the moment that he bore Seth, or that he and Eve had Seth, then that is what is being carried forward as well in Seth. So that's kind of that's both sides of it. That is the positive and negative side, and that what Scripture is getting at here may encompass those things. We're not really sure, but we are sure that it's sort of using the same language when it speaks of Adam's relationship to Seth and God's relationship to Adam. It's using intentionally some of the same language. So that should give us pause and should cause us to consider what exactly is being said here from that. Now, I want to speak briefly to the genealogies here. because of these genealogies that are listed, we find genealogies here in chapter 5 and also in chapter 10 and 11. Um, if let's take the genealogy here in chapter 5 takes us down until the birth of Noah. And then, of course, we know how old Noah was when the flood began. We're told that, I believe, in the next chapter. Um, but because of that, because of the ages and when people bore children, we are able to piece together a timeline, a chronology of how long passed since Adam, from Adam to Noah to the flood, even specifically. And what we come up with, if we just simply crunch the numbers that are given here, we come up with 1,656 years from Adam um, to the flood, and that seems pretty straightforward, and it indeed might be straightforward. I tend to think that that's pretty sound. There's a couple of considerations that have been mentioned. One is pretty minor. One is that, well, this is a very minor, very silly thing, I think. But it's worth noting, perhaps, that of course, did they have? Are we talking about 365-day years? Um, Probably not. Probably 360-day years, because they would have been for Israel. They were on a lunar calendar, which is slightly different than a solar calendar that we're used to. But again, you're talking about 5 days for every year. That's not a significant amount of time when you're talking about 1600 plus years. Um, Now, something else that's been suggested is that the genealogies, for instance, the genealogies in chapter 5, are simply a what's called a selective genealogy, which means that it left out certain generations, certain people. That's been Scholars have suggested that, and what that would mean is that you're talking about a longer period of time from Adam to the flood. If that's the case, um, are there places in Scripture that use selective genealogies where certain people are sort of left out? There are some, and where this comes from is when you read through, and this is clear in, for instance, like the King James, I think still uses the word begat. Some of them use the phrase fathered or became the father of. Um, the Hebrew there is, you could simply render that as became so and so became the ancestor of. So when you define it as simply a father son, instead of perhaps grandfather to grandson or great grandfather, and you can see where, and again, some scholars have suggested that there are gaps here. Personally, from the text, um, I don't see any indication of that. I don't find any reason to assume that not to assume that there's generations that are included but are not listed in that. It just doesn't seem to make sense when you look at the ages when it says so and so. You know, is that the age when this next person was born? Well, then if they were, even if they were a grandfather and you're skipping that other generation, if you're tracking that from the time that's mentioned of, for instance, Adam to Seth, when we're pretty clear that's actually his son. So I don't, from the text, even though scholars have suggested, I don't find any indication that's the case, that this is a selective genealogy. I find that this is pretty straightforward and that it includes all of the names and all the generations in there. Again, textually, I think you run into some trouble when you try to assume that. Again, there are some places in Scripture that do that, in the list of a genealogy, but from my knowledge, it only does that when we have the other genealogy, and it's just kind of shorthanding it for the sake of a certain narrative, to get to the point. But it's not leaving out information that can't be found elsewhere, in terms of being able to put together a chronology or a timeline. So I'm comfortable with the time frame of 1656 years from Adam to the flood of Noah in Genesis 6. A couple other things I want to note. Of course, a highlight from this chapter is Enoch. Now, we don't know a whole lot about Enoch. At least the Old Testament doesn't tell us much. We get a couple verses here. He's mentioned a couple times in the New Testament, but that's pretty much it. We know that he walked with God, and that because of that, he did not see death. So, what does that tell us? What value does that have in the narrative? Well, it has a great value when it comes to the concept of hope, because if you leave out the case of Enoch, the story tends to take on a mostly only negative connotation, and so when you have this glimpse of this one descendant of Adam who is he however he did this, we know from Hebrews that it was by faith, but that he had an intimate personal relationship with God, and that is all we know about him, and really apparently that's all we need to know about him. um, and that gives a tremendously hopeful tone for anyone reading this story, that this offer of walking with God, like Adam and Eve did before the fall, it's still available. It's still out there for people who diligently seek to walk with God. That is an offer that is still viable for us as people in our current condition, and that's tremendously good news. That is hopeful, in an otherwise fairly hopeless story. When you find bits and pieces of that, you find also those, in the line of Seth, who begin to call on the name of the Lord, Yahweh. Um, and so, in a world where there's developing a lot of, culturally, there would have been a lot of polytheistic tendencies, the worship of other gods and so forth. We find that there are some still who call in the name of the one supreme creator of the universe, Yahweh. So, a couple of these glimpses that we see, because when we get into chapter 6, again, the positive in chapter 6 is that Noah and his family, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He found favor. And because of that, he is spared. And of course, we're going to spend our time, actually a couple of weeks, talking about Genesis chapter 6. One other thing I want to note about Enoch. So there are a couple of Enochs mentioned. There's an Enoch listed in the lineage of Cain. This is a different Enoch. Okay, that was a separate one, same name, but different individual. This Enoch is presumably the one who the book of Enoch, specifically First Enoch, talks about, presumably talks about his story. Now, again, we have to be careful here because we're talking about extra biblical texts. Do I think Enoch wrote First Enoch? I don't think so. Do I think that maybe it carried his tradition and his maybe some truths about him and his experience? Perhaps. And the challenge we find with that is, of course, it wasn't included in the canon of Scripture, and I think rightly so. I think the church made the right call on that. Some early church fathers disagreed, but I do think that the book of Enoch, although helpful for us, and it was also a book that is referenced several times by several human authors in the New Testament. The New Testament authors seemed to assume that their audience was at least familiar with the story in First Enoch. So, having said that, why I don't think it was written as a contemporary or even soon after this Enoch lived that we find in Genesis 5, the reason for that is the earliest indications and the earliest writings of Enoch that we find is 4th century BC, so like earlier Second Temple period, and even you could push that back at the earliest to 5th century BC, um, but nothing before that. Now, does that mean uh, that it's not carrying forward the tradition of Enoch and telling his story? And it doesn't necessarily mean that that's not the case. But again, I'm very reluctant to place a lot of emphasis on it simply because it's not scripture. And so the potential of things in it, and I've read it. It's a very fascinating book. It's very apocalyptic in its type of literature, similar to that of um, some portions of the book of Daniel, some portions of the book of Ezekiel, Revelation. It's the similar kind of flavor there, which makes it kind of a challenging read. But it's pretty wild. I mean, you get a lot more details about what we're going to talk about next time, about the Nephilim, the giants, about the sons of God, um, the Watchers. Now, I will say this, and we'll expand this more as we get into the next chapter for the next session. But I know people who Christians, well-read Christians even, who just outright reject. There's nothing in the Book of Enoch that is true or helpful for us. We should just reject it entirely. Here's the problem with that. If you read in Genesis 6, if your translation, and many biblical translations use this word, if your translation uses the word giant in place of Nephilim, where do you think that connection came from? Where do you think we got the idea that Nephilim were giants? There's only one place where that comes from, and that is from the Enochian tradition. It comes from the book of Enoch, that connection that Nephilim are actually giants. Because otherwise, without that, we don't really know how to translate or how to understand what Nephilim was talking about. It's the book of Enoch that makes that connection for us. And so I think at the very least, it's worth being aware of that this is something that influenced um, thought of many of the New Testament authors. They were aware of it. It apparently influenced many of even in Old Testament, the concepts and the things that were spoken of and addressed there. So take that for what it's worth. But suffice it to say that many human authors of Scripture also read other books and were familiar with other writings, and they cite other writings. Doesn't mean that they're absolutely true 100% of the time, but it does mean that they are assuming that their audience had some familiarity with the story. And I think that is the case with the book of Enoch. And then, of course, the last thing, chapter 5 ends with, leads up to Noah, and then it mentions his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And it's really driving the narrative forward, setting things up for chapter 6, where we get into the flood and God's decision to wipe out humanity and other things that were becoming a problem and corrupting his good world that he had made. And so, again, I wish you well in your studies. Dig into some of these things in chapter 5. There's more to talk about there, but just kind of giving some framework to that. So I wish you well, and I'll be praying for you guys. Thank you.